It's a splendid venue to talk about this new book, particularly because so much Scottish art goes in and out of this very room.
For huge amounts of money.
Obviously.
And that's part of this whole thing, is just for you to say, really, we probably don't appreciate what we have in Scottish art as much as we should.
Well, I learned a huge amount about Scottish art, my heritage in writing this book, and there was so much that I didn't know and I didn't appreciate. And so I hope that this book is an introduction to an audience who might not think Scottish art is a subject for them, but I also hope that in here there are anecdotes, artefacts, paintings and objects that people who think they know the story might get a little surprised with.
Well, it's interesting that that's very modest of you to say you didn't know totally the story, because of course when you did the television series, that was one thing, but had you always in your mind when you were doing the series, I need to dig in a bit deeper?
Making television is wonderful, and as you know, in 60 minutes you can cover quite a lot. In 4 hours of telly, 4 programmes, we covered 5,000 years of Scottish history and Scottish art. But inevitably, there were vast gaps. There were so many artists who we didn't have time to explore because the whole format didn't permit it. So writing the book was my opportunity to dig deeper, to cross off the names that I regretted not including in the TV series, and also to expand on some of the stories that we had already told and reveal a little bit more.
And that revelation begins way back in Neolithic times with the Towie ball, and I think we can see that on the first slide now. I mean, it's an extraordinary sculpture.
Yeah, it is, and it's exactly that. I think we get the sense sometimes that 5,000 years ago is a place that inhabited by barbarians hurling rocks at one another. But when you look at an artefact like the Towie ball, which was created about 2,500 years BC, it is a sculpture. It is an extraordinary piece of craftsmanship, and it is a mesmerising piece of design, and it's still relevant. It still zaps your eyeballs.
And the thing is, it's very rooted in place, and we've no idea what it symbolised. Was it money? Was it power? Was it some kind of magic?
Yeah.
But there are hundreds of these things.
Yes, they've dug up, apparently, about 430 and counting, and they're only located in Orkney, Shetland, and the northeast coast of Scotland. And one of the things that I find so compelling about exploring that sort of 3,000-year period is we don't have the answers. We don't know why the standing stones at the Ness of Brodgar are there. We don't know why the cup and ring marks are pecked into the rocks in Kilmartin Glen. We have no explanation, lots of theories. And that leaves a space open to the imagination.
Yes, but everybody is also trying to find out how the Towie ball was carved, what implements they used. I mean, eventually one day, I do hope we find out.
Well, yes, there have been experiments. Archaeologists have tried to recreate objects like the Towie ball using the implements we think they had then, and they found it virtually impossible. And I think that reveals the sense that the technical proficiency that people had then was astounding, but also the motivation to create ornaments and objects in their immediate environment that were beautiful. They were not simply preoccupied with survival, they had space for art.
And so therefore, in a way, you understood that they had this idea of some kind of feeling of creativity, which is beyond the everyday survival.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we find some of these carved balls in the homes that have been unearthed of Neolithic settlements. They had them on their mantelpieces in Skara Brae. Now, you suggested that they could have been objects that conferred kind of authority or power on specific people in a tribe or a group. And that's one of the speculations. At a meeting of the tribal council, this could have been the object that gave you permission to speak. But they might also just have been ornaments. And ornamentation, we've discovered. Pottery, carved spatulas, bits of whalebone that have been ornamented. All of these things were there to brighten the day, to enhance the experience of being alive.
But there is no doubt, when you look, I was just funnily enough at Macri Moor and Aaron at the Standing Stones, this feeling of spirituality, that there was some kind of other being, has been with people for thousands of years.
Yes, and when you go, I was recently at Callanish, and when you stand on the Isle of Lewis amidst this circle of standing stones, and again, we're not really clear the purpose of it all, but it does make you feel connected to the landscape, to a sense of soulfulness that transports me, anyway, from 2020 to 2,500 years BC. And that, I think, is empathy, and that is what art does. It is a vehicle for creating empathy across centuries.
And soulfulness. I mean, I think art is about soulfulness in many ways, just as you say. The next image, though, is the Nig stone.
Yeah.
Let's look at the Nig stone, because, of course, it's so different as what it would have been then.
Yeah, well, we've leapt forward. We're kind of around about the 9th century now. And this is an exquisite piece of Pictish carving. And it is very different from how it might have appeared in that period, because we think that the exquisite carving was coloured. So people have often had this idea that Pictish culture didn't exist, really. This was a land of ferocious fighters bearing tattoos who, because we have not discovered any manuscript evidence, we believe didn't even have a written language. But in the course of making the films and writing the book, it was revealed to me that actually archaeologists are finding increasing amounts of evidence to suggest that this too was an exquisitely sophisticated culture that was motivated by art, and that the Nig stone would itself have been fully coloured when it was first created, ablaze with colour, and in fact represents perhaps a template for the kinds of Pictish manuscripts that we don't have anymore.
And I suppose the nearest thing you would say in terms of that colour would be the Book of Kells.
Yeah, well, the Nig stone is discovered in the Tarbet Peninsula, the east coast of Scotland, north of Inverness. The Book of Kells was created around 800, we think, on the west coast at Iona. And there's always been this tension, the idea that artistry, religion, civilization came to Scotland from the west coast. It came over from Ireland with Columba, and the Christian faith allowed it to spread across the mainland. But recent discoveries, recent studies have shown that in the Tarbet Peninsula, where the Nig stone is, there are the remains of the Portmahomac monastery. And that during the period that Iona was thriving, there was a rival community where Christianity had embedded itself on the east coast. And objects like the Nig stone are representative of the sophistication of the craftsmen stonemasons that they had at their disposal.
And then for the next image, we then leap on a bit further and we come to the fountain at Linlithgow.
Yeah.
I mean, it's extraordinary because actually, as an artist yourself, when you look at the architecture, I mean, right through the Jameses, what they were doing as kings was bringing art, architecture, and power. It was an expression of power, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And modernity.
Well, there's a connection between Pictish sculpture, cross slabs like the Nig stone, and the fountain that is at Linlithgow Palace. I mean, we have leapt from around 800 to 1538. I mean, it's a great, swathe of time. But across that period, art was being exploited by the people who had power, by the landowners, the tribal leaders, the early kings of Scotland, and with the fountain at Linlithgow, James V, to use art as a tool for cementing their authority. So the dynasty of Stuart monarchs, from James I, crowned in 1424, to this great fountain created under the auspices of James V in 1538. We have a dynasty of kings who are sponsoring the enhancement of palaces, the creation of sculptures, the decoration of royal palaces, all in order to keep up to a certain extent.
But also because they knew what was happening in Italy. They knew what was happening in France. And they saw no reason why they shouldn't be doing that as well, because the connections were actually happening all the time.
Yeah.
By marriage, dynastic merchants.
I think some people like to poo-poo the idea that there was anything like a Renaissance in Scotland. And in Italy, from the 15th century to the 16th century, there is this kind of extraordinary explosion of artistry. And here in Scotland, we were not quite at the transcendental limits of that. But the monarchs, the people in power, were very much aware of what was going on the continent, and they were importing stonemasons, they were importing artists to come and guide them on this path in this kind of isolated and fiscally challenged world, the land at the end, northwestern end of continental Europe, to make our own mini-Renaissance.
And when you look at it, you see it in Falkland, Paris, you see it in Kinross House at Sir William Bruce, you see what happened at Holyrood.
Yes.
You realise that we were capable and we're executing, I think, architecture every bit as much as impressive as in Europe.
Well, I think I possibly would pause. I think I'm always careful with Scottish art and with the enthusiasm of the Scot to say that, we're as gallus, we're as great. And I don't think...
Wasn't very, it's not so...
It's not as refined. It's not. But it is, as I say in the book, it is a Scottish barn dance of a Renaissance. It is an enthusiastic cry for artistry in a community where there simply wasn't the same ability or appetite.
I think it's interesting you say there wasn't a barn dance, because that was... James was in Europe.
Yes.
He went with all these courtiers.
500.
Supposedly on a wedding tour. And his stonemasons all that. Now, I think that actually stands.
It does. It is. It's a beautiful piece of design. It's a fantastic piece of sculpture. And, there is no questioning that should be appreciated and admired in the context of a Renaissance that was spreading across Europe. But in Scotland, we also had other things. There was a Renaissance going on along the west coast of Scotland and in the Hebridean Isles under the auspices of the lordship of the Isles. There's a magnificent style of West Highland sculpture that you see on Iona, from Celtic crosses to cross slabs to grave slabs to cloisters and chapels, that are again a manifestation of a Scottish interpretation of Renaissance. And it's, the carvings of Celtic knotwork, beautiful braiding in stones. It is very distinct from this kind of poised, elegant refinement of what Michelangelo was busy creating in Rome, or artists were painting in Florence. But I agree, it stands comparison as a different demonstration of artistic appetite.
So your father, and I can remember him well, he stand at his window with I remember he had a beard.
He did, theatrical beard.
Was a very, very important portrait painter in Scotland. So you grew up with art all around you from a young age.
Yeah.
Were you aware so much as a child of what was out there in Scottish art, or was it mainly your father's oeuvre, if I want a better word?
Well, my father was an extremely theatrical character, and he was a very strong presence, and the paintings that he created were the manifestation of that, and our house was full of them. So I was very much aware of his work, and I was conscious of what was going on in contemporary Scotland. But what Dad did, he alerted me to the glories of Scottish art historically, more than what was happening at the time. So when I, as a child, demonstrated an enthusiasm for drawing and painting, my father wouldn't sit me down and teach me to draw, but he would pull out a book by Raeburn and make me draw the MacNab. Or he would pull out a book by Ramsay and make me draw something from that. And in the process of, copying these images and doing my, very naive versions as a sort of 7 or 8 year old, I not only sort of improved my ability to draw, but I began to understand that in Scotland there was a particular legacy of painting and art, and indeed portraiture, which was my father's particular domain, that had been influenced by things happening across the world, but felt in some way distinct to Scotland. And that was certainly an urge I wanted to explore when I was writing the book.
Well, let's look at the next image, because here we come on to portraiture, and there we have the young James, 8 years old. His mother is in some English jail. His father is dead.
Yes.
And he is being raised at the Elizabethan court.
Yeah, well, this is quite a stunning portrait. It is painted by Arnold Bronkhorst. It's 1574. He's an 8-year-old boy. And what you're looking at is a portrait of a young boy who is being schooled rigorously by Presbyterian scholars.
First Protestant.
Indeed, in the limits of the authority of the king. This is a child whose backstory is pretty horrendous and whose future is looking iffy. And in this portrait, I just think there is once again this manifestation of empathy. Arnold Bronkhorst is an immigrant artist from the Low Countries who's come over to Scotland, and he finds himself confronted with this young king, and he paints a portrait of clarity where the line and the tonal control are so exquisite, but it communicates character and it shows sympathy for the model. And I do think that you can trace a thread from the kind of clarity, analysis, honesty of this kind of portraiture, through to the work that you see being created by Allan Ramsay, on to Raeburn, on to James Cowie, through to Alison Watt. There's a strand that connects Scottish portraiture as a genre which I think has been distinctive to Scotland, particularly strong in Scotland. And its origins, its roots, I believe, lie in this kind of 16th century portraiture and the artists who arrived here to teach us, really, how to become great portrait artists.
So then we have to move on, and your next choice is after the Union of 1707, and indeed the period of the Enlightenment. You've talked about Allan Ramsay, but talk through this image.
Well, I mean, Allan Ramsay is an absolutely staggering portrait painter. I think he is, the first great painter from Scotland who can stand on any stage and really be venerated. And this portrait is him as a young man. I think it was either painted in Rome or just after he'd returned from Rome.
Early, didn't he?
Yeah, I think this is about 1737 to 1739. And Allan Ramsay is a young man who had grown up in Edinburgh and already been noticed for his skills, had gone to London and then ventured off on the first of 3 trips that he would take during his lifetime to Rome, where he would spend years. And it was this period in history of the Grand Tour when young men of means, particularly, would be given this chance to go and learn from the greats. And Ramsay's portrait here is evidence, a demonstration of what he learnt at the easels of some of the great Italian masters. It's a stunning painting.
It's stunning, and the light and the way he deals with the velvet is extraordinary.
But it's also bravado.
Yes.
It's also a marker. Come and commission from me, because I'll make you look like this.
This is my calling card. He did the most beautiful portrait of his wife, Margaret Lindsay. That's another absolutely stunning portrait.
The 2 portraits that he did of his wife, Anna Bain and then Margaret Lindsay, are just the most delicate love letters to the people who were at that time most important in his life. The portrait of the young Anna Bain, his first wife, who would die in childbirth. Just to look at the way that he painted the mouth and to note the sort of tension in her body, a subject who you see is uneasy being portrayed. But he represents her in such a beautiful way. It's a lesson to all portrait painters forever. I used to think that Allan Ramsay's paintings were a bit cool. I could never quite emotionally relate to them.
That's interesting, because I probably think that you can emotionally relate. We'll come on to talk about Raeburn in a minute. I think Raeburn's paintings I can really find a lot of emotion in. But before we get to Raeburn, because I know we're not representing Raeburn, but we need to talk about Raeburn.
Absolutely.
Let's go on to our first female artist.
Yes.
And she's also contemporary of Raeburn's. But again, Catherine Reid, let's see her image. Tell me about her first before we talk about the Gentleman of Rome.
Well, Catherine Reid is a remarkable artist. She's one of the first female painters to be included in this great survey. And she was part of a family that had Jacobite sympathies. So after Culloden in 1746, she and her family escaped first to Paris and then to Rome, where Catherine Reid found herself kind of surrounded by the Jacobite expatriate community. She was sponsored by them. She ended up painting.
She was 24.
Yeah, she was a young and exquisitely talented artist, but she was almost nurtured by this environment. And the opportunity she was given to paint local aristocrats, to paint Jacobite Scots, seems to have in some ways emanated from the Jacobite court itself, which is intriguing. But
they wanted a record anyway, didn't they?
Well, they didn't care the gender of the artist. They wanted portraits. They wanted portraits that they could probably have in their room that represented, Bonnie Prince Charlie, the king that they wanted to place on the throne. their own, which represented a religious iconography of the Catholic faith that they all held dear. But this particular painting of British gentlemen in Rome, I just think it's such a wonderful brush lashing of the kind of young, noisy, entitled British gents who probably, these noisy British tourists who are probably still familiar with. But these young guys were meant to be going off to Italy to get a slice of cultural capital, to find themselves educated, enhanced by the experience. And she arranges them as if they're a sort of a classical frieze, but they all look just that wee bit squat. Just that little bit as if actually they're not talking about the riches of classical culture. They're on a tavern crawl. Yes. And the fact that Catherine Reed puts that into that painting, it's brilliant.
I think that she just puts so much expression in the figures. It's extraordinary.
Well, she was a brilliant painter, and I didn't know anything about her.
Well, actually, very few people. I didn't know about her either, and that's to my shame, because there's so few women artists of that time anyway. We should know them.
Well, we should know them, but we should also distinguish those like Catherine Reed who need to be represented and talked about on the merit of their work, which is great. And Christina Robertson, who comes later on in the book, who was one of the favourite artists of Tsar Nicholas I, who made a career in the Russian court. In the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, there's a gallery of portraits by Christina Robertson, which probably represents the biggest collection of Scottish art outside of Scotland. And I didn't know about that either until I wrote this book. And there's another name that we need to know more about.
And also at that time, contemporary, of course, is Raeburn.
Yeah.
There's Raeburns in the Met.
Yes.
In New York, there's Raeburns all over the place. And Raeburn was a fine, fine painter. One of my favourite, I always laugh when I look at it, is a skating minister. It's maybe not meant to be funny, but I love it, and I just think it is so funny.
It is. That's an iconic work. What I love about Raeburn, though, is that whereas Ramsay has this exquisite control, Raeburn has this kind of flamboyance, this painterliness that I, as an artist, would love to be able to achieve. It's more my painting style. There's a speed to his brushwork. He would work, wet on wet, with lots of wet oil paint on the palette, with a very long brush apparently. He would approach his canvas from a distance, running up to it, and he would kind of paint his image with great speed. But the thing about Raeburn, which I think is so magnificent, is that not only was he creating portraits in which there is a breath of life. Yeah. You feel that the sitter is alive because the paint moves so much. But he, like Ramsay, was embodying that spirit of the Enlightenment, this sort of idea of empiricism where you observe, you clearly study your subject, you forensically put down what you are seeing, and in the process, you capture the personality of the sitter.
And of course that was the case with Scott, because of course Raeburn paints Scotland, so you get a sense of Scott.
Yes, absolutely. And the reason why you are seeing Raeburn's in the Met, and why his work is perhaps more widely distributed in collections than Ramsay, is because we're now entering, the period of Romanticism. And Raeburn is the artist that, for me, anyway, he sort of crosses, he's a bridge into the Romantic era, and his kind of flamboyant way of painting ties into the kind of imagery that was making Scotland a kind of phenomenal blockbuster during that period.
Yeah, but then we come on to an image, for better or worse, which ends up defining Scotland, right, for like 100 years since, and is still one of the defining images, and we can see it now. Look, who doesn't know that image?
Well, the Monarch of the Glen,
it's responsible for a lot of problems.
Well, it is. Now listen, the Monarch of the Glen has been acquired by the National Galleries of Scotland in the last few years, and it is apparently the best-selling item in the gift shop. So the Monarch of the Glen is an enormously popular painting, and it is one, it has been...
Ramsay is a wonderful painting. All I'm saying is, it is interesting because, as you say, it is Romanticism.
Yeah, it is. Now, but we have to, when we're thinking about art history, we must be conscious of the prejudices that we carry today.
On my back.
And we must time travel.
Yeah.
We've got to go back to this moment when Scotland's landscape and the iconography of the stag and the heather hadn't become a bit of a shortbread tin cover. No. It was radically new.
And this was as a result of Queen Victoria coming to Scotland, loving Scotland, wanting Landseer to paint images that she could feel at home with.
Yes, so it is a fib. It's a myth. It's storytelling to suit, a a wealthy, your Majesty, what would you like? I'll paint it for you. People resent it because this image is extraordinarily, prolifically reproduced everywhere. But also because in some ways it's believed to be an imposition, a colonial myth imposed upon Scotland by an Englishman, Landseer, and also representative of a sport, stag hunting, that replaced poor people's lives with rich people's sport. So all of that baggage is woven into this painting, but it is iconic. It is exquisitely painted, and Scotland should be astounded and grateful that across the planet, from Beijing to Timbuktu, people who think of Scotland will dream up an image that is something like Landseer's. And that kind of currency, that's what art history, the legacy of Scotland's art history that we have been given. And, for better or worse, we do proud.
But you say everybody knows it. I'm not sure everybody does. And I think this is a thread that runs through the book. Obviously, what you're saying is you want people to become more acquainted with Scottish art and the power of Scottish art. And then we come on to a period which is probably the period that we know best and that there's a lot more information about. And that is a period that takes in the Glasgow Boys, the colorists, and also Mackintosh. Let's start, though, with one of your favourite images. Yeah. And I love this image too, and this is Hind's Daughter by James Guthrie. Well, let's talk about this.
Well, Guthrie's painting for me is a kind of lodestar. I was given a book, a big leather-bound book on Guthrie when I was a young artist, and it's all the illustrations inside were in black and white. And it didn't matter with Guthrie, because Guthrie and the group that was around in the Glasgow Boys were tonal painters. So their ambition was to paint realistic subjects, paint rural subjects, but respecting, accurately reproducing the tonal values of outdoor light. That kind of overcast, dissipated quality of light we're so familiar with in Scotland. And in a black and white reproduction, it was clear to me, not only did these paintings have extraordinary power, but they had subtlety. And the Hind's Daughter is, in spite of the fact the palette is so muted, it's a painting that is luminous. It's a glow. And to have achieved that when the precedent for painting at that time was the sort of highly saturated Landseers and McCullochs that were, the heather and the gloaming, to transition into a period when Scottish artists were studying light in a different way, when they were conscious of what was going on in Paris and in France, and bringing that to Scotland is remarkable.
And that was, it's interesting you should say, because that was painted at Coburn's Path.
Yeah.
Now, and that wonderful with the red Pantal roofs, of course, that came over from Dutch boats.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's why that east coast has got so many red Pantals. But what I think is so extraordinary about that is because it is not the Highlands. Yeah. It is not the grandeur that you might actually see in Landseer. It is Coburn's Path.
Yes.
It was a much less. Well, it was a gently undulating landscape and a very rural area.
Well, they're very consciously creating a muted version of Scotland. So all of these artists, they called their precedents the glue pots, because they used to they found the colour, the treacly layers of varnish that the artists that had come before them used was very distasteful to them. And they didn't want to have that big sort of amplified version of Scotland. They wanted to create a story of intimacy in their painting. So we find intimate scenes of a bend in the river, or a path going into the forest, or a girl who is standing up in a field of kale and looking back at you. And the Coburn's Path in the southeast Berkshire coast of Scotland was certainly the complete opposite of all of the highland landscapes that an artist like McCulloch had made his trademark. They knew exactly what they were doing, and that's what they were hunting for. And Guthrie, and this was painted around about 1883, he spent the whole year in Coburn's Path. Many of the Glasgow Boys would go there together and spend a summer. Guthrie was there autumn, winter, spring and summer, and in his paintings you can see that familiarity with the landscape and the people. There is an honesty in the way that he depicts it, which is wonderful.
And to the other side, then there was the great grouping that went to Kirkcudbright.
Yes.
I was down there, and then there was much more intense, all the hornels and so forth that were much more intense colouring.
Yes. Well, the Glasgow Boys are not, a group. They would not have seen themselves as a defined group. Artists are far too self-involved, selfish, and concerned with their own careers to want to be given a label. So there is a great deal of diversity in approach to the work that the Glasgow Boys created. And you mentioned Hornell. One of Hornell's great friends was Bessie McNichol, who is, a label that is has been devised over the last 20 years is the Glasgow Girls. It's a label that I find unnecessary because I think that all of these artists are part of a zeitgeist more than a grouping. And people like Bessie McNichol, who are working like Hornell with a much more vibrant colour palette, with a greater kind of fluidity to the way that they're painting. A stunning artist.
A stunning artist. In a way, the same as Beth Morisot and Mary Cassatt, and Gwen John.
Yeah.
We know so much less than them because people that were writing the books and buying the art in those days were men.
Yes, well, that's true. Bessie McNichol, she had a short life, a truncated life, but during that life she produced, just the most stunning paintings. There is no doubt that women in that time period were handicapped by the fact that they weren't allowed into the life drawing classes. They were forced to wear clothing that was not practical for studio work. They were not necessarily permitted. Catherine Reed, we were speaking about the 18th century, she would not have been permitted to go and visit the collections of art in Rome that a gentleman would have been. Without question, doors would have opened to him. So that if you're not given the experience of looking at certain kinds of painting, if you're not given an opportunity to draw the human figure at a time when that's all that mattered in painting, was how you painted the human figure, then it's no wonder that some of the work is going to have to fight to be recognised, and that the artists themselves simply were not allowed to proliferate in the way that would have been much more appropriate.
And then we move on to an artist who graces the cover of your book,
yes,
which is tremendous, who is Arthur Melville. And then let's talk about Arthur.
Well, Arthur Melville is, he's another artist that spans periods. So he was on the periphery of the Glasgow Boys group. They all venerated Arthur Melville, but he didn't really stick around very long with them. Instead, he went off on the most exotic journey across the Middle East. It was 10,000 miles was this escapade where he went first to Egypt, and then he went across the Red Sea, and he found himself in Baghdad, and he travelled across the desert back through to Constantinople. And in the process of this, I think it went on for a year and a bit, this journey, he, an artist having already spent a little bit of time in Paris learning how to develop techniques in watercolour, used those skills to paint light with an exuberance that I have found absolutely mind-blowing. And this watercolour dates from his return after this great epic journey, when he finds himself in Paris on the occasion of the Exposition Universelle, when there were a number of great exhibitions happening showcasing the work of contemporary French artists like Van Gogh and so on. And one night he and some chums go off to the cabaret, and during the process of, it's called the Moulin Rouge, but we don't actually think it was in the Moulin Rouge because it wasn't open at the date of when this painting was created. He's in a room that is full of noise and dancing. He's quaffing something that is making him feel more and more relaxed. He gets his watercolour box out and he splashes colour across the sketchbook page in a way that to our eyes looks like abstract painting. He was not an abstract painter, but he was simply indulging and relishing the opportunity to create colour and create imagery for the sake of it, that I found so powerful that when asked what the cover of the book should be, I really didn't hesitate. It had to be this watercolour. It had to be something that looks so timeless and so un-Scottish that it would be an eye-catcher, I hoped.
And then we come on to the lesser known of a very famous duo, and another woman, and that, of course, is Margaret MacDonald.
Yeah.
A sublime artist, actually. Never to be given her place, I think, in her lifetime.
No, Margaret MacDonald was an extraordinary artist. Charles Rennie Mackintosh once said, I had the talent, Margaret had the genius, we made a pair. And some people have interpreted that to suggest that maybe Margaret was, part of the brains behind Mackintosh's oeuvre. I don't agree with that. I think Mackintosh was an utterly unique, extraordinary creative force whose ability spanned across so many different genres that he represents to me possibly the very top artist in the story of Scottish art. But he was enabled by his creative partner, Margaret MacDonald, who he had met at art school when he was a young man. And her ability to steady him, to confirm his genius, to input into his work, and to supplement the buildings that he was creating and the objects, the furniture that he was designing, with her own art is phenomenally important. And the image that we have here of the Seven Princesses was commissioned about 1902 by Fritz Werndorfer, who was a Viennese textile millionaire. And he was a great supporter of the secessionist movement in Vienna at the time. And he wanted a music salon to be decorated. And he commissioned Mackintosh and Margaret MacDonald to create the works that would surround them. This extraordinary 15-foot work of gesso relief was hidden and lost until 1990 in the vaults of the Mack Museum in Vienna. They didn't know what they had in this particular packing case, and when they opened it, they pulled out this masterpiece. And it is a bona fide masterpiece of Scottish art by Margaret MacDonald that, I mean, should be celebrated much more than it is.
And where is it now?
It's in Vienna.
It needs to come to Glasgow.
It needs to come on a trip. But if ever there was an object that did support the argument that Margaret MacDonald requires a greater platform on which to be appreciated, it's this work.
But isn't part of the problem with this is that often, Margaret MacDonald did it, but Jessie M. King did it as well. She was a brilliant painter. Watercolours are brilliant, but that they did illustration. Illustration sometimes was seen as being the letter. It was like what women did.
Well, it still is. And I mean, throughout this book, one of the things that I have championed is artists today are respected as these cerebral beings, and their work is chins are stroked over it non-stop and heads are scratched. It's a cerebral problem that is posed. But actually, throughout history, artists have been craftsmen and women. They've been there to perform a purpose. And creating illustrations, illustrating stories or tales or whatever it might be, is just as worthy a job as creating a work of art that is kind of only there to make us think about big ideas and life and death and so on. It matters, and it matters that the whole panorama of Scottish art has all these different tiers in it.
And there was a great exhibition of women artists at the Gallery Modern Art
yes.
a couple of years ago, which really was terrific, and went some way to redressing that. And in that, I just thinking in that exhibition was the most wonderful black and white image of the man who's probably the ultimate colourist, with his wonderful wife, and that is, of course, J.D. Ferguson.
Yeah.
I mean, and that is your next image.
Well, J.D. Ferguson is an artist who I have kind of focused on. In the book, there was always this dilemma. As we move into the 19th century and the early 20th century, there are more artists, there's more scholarship, there are more books to consult, there are more people out there who know 1,000 times more than I ever could
and every
about
one
this
of
subject.
The colourists has a book to himself. If it's Cadell, if it's
exactly.
Petlo, they've all got books.
There's so much written. What could I do? So all I wanted to do was choose the artists that I felt more empathy with and try and tell their personal stories. And J.D. Ferguson's personal story of self-discovery in Paris at the turn of the 20th century is it's a wonderful read, but it's also a genuine journey in artistic exploration.
It just occurs to me, though, just breaking off for a minute, they lived in Clouston Street when they came back.
That's true.
So did your father see them?
No, but as someone who used to tutor me in mathematics when I was a little schoolboy, we used to see J.D. Ferguson in the street, and he was around, and he was by that point, a grandfather figure of Scottish art. But in these early years, in the early 20th century, they were the Scottish colourists were anathema. First of all, they weren't aware of what J.D. Ferguson was doing. He had gone off to Paris in about 1907 to the capital of global art, where the greatest and most radical leaps were happening in music and literature and dance and painting.
And of course, his wife was a great dancer.
And his wife, who arrived later, is a great dancer and became integral to many of the paintings that he created. But what, for me, J.D. Ferguson represents is someone who wasn't just a bystander. He was a Scottish artist who was present at the moment when some of the most extraordinary transformations were happening in the avant-garde in contemporary art in France. But by 1909, he himself was a sociétaire of the Salon d'Automne. The Salon d'Automne was the most radical exhibition group on the planet. It was the breakaway group from the conventional Paris Salon.
And you can see his art change.
Well, you can see it responding to the birth of Fauvism. And this is one of the paintings that actually he exhibited in his kind of installment exhibition in 1909. And we can see him, I mean, he's using the touchstone of conventional portraiture, but he's also testing the power of colour and the graphic ability to compose on a level which is, I mean, absolutely thrilling. He's at the vanguard of British art in this period. Nobody else is working in this way. And people across the Channel had no idea what he was doing.
One of my favourite pictures of his is there's a self-portrait. He's wearing a cap.
Yeah.
But the thing about that which is so good is he's smiling. It's so unusual in portraiture. He's sort of looking
it's hard to paint a smile and it's hard to hold a smile.
And he did it. And it was absolutely amazing.
But that's because J.D. Ferguson was a man of swagger. I mean, he was handsome, but he was in love with himself. He was in love with just about every woman who walked into the room, and he was in love with the act of painting. And by 1913, where he had moved from Paris to the south of France, to Antibes, he was simply, this is a boy from Leith. You know, this is a boy who grew up in the kind of slightly arid Presbyterian Edinburgh, where everything was just a wee bit dry. Can you imagine what it was like sitting under a fig tree in a garden in Antibes in the bloody sunshine, when you suddenly realise the wonder of life and you want to express it in pigment and paint, and that's what you did. Yes,
and he stayed there until, as I say, much later he came back to Twisted Street. If we moved back a little bit, just post-war, we come on to a completely different atmosphere, and that's the painting of William McCann.
Yeah. Well, Scottish artists had lots of different responses to, obviously, to the horror of World War I. And what we can see here in William McCan's work is almost a desire to kind of wage war on any idea of what Scottish art should look like. He's creating imagery that's partly inspired by what he has seen in London. He's moved to London with his wife, Agnes Miller Parker, who was a great printmaker and artist in her own right. But they've been exposed to the imagery of the Vorticists, who are creating abstract images of kind of mechanisation and industrialisation. And he is, in this painting, absolutely assaulting our eyes with something that to me looks like a kind of terrifying assault that's about to happen. All these forms are about to collapse upon one another. They are mechanistic, they are machine-like. William McCants was a pacifist. He, during the war, had been turfed into jail after graduating as a teacher. He was not allowed to go and teach, and he spent part of the war in jail dismantling a gallows in the prison where he was kept. So he had experience of suffering and hardship and exposure to the ideas of violence. And in many of his works, you see that surfacing. There were other artists who actually had, were experiencing the horrors. Maurice Meredith Williams, who was in the trenches at the time, is creating sketches of what he is seeing, and they are, some of the most extraordinary pieces of reportage. And his wife, who is in Scotland at the time, these are English artists who have moved to Scotland, Alice Meredith Williams, is using these sketches to dream up sculptures that are going to end up being some of the most important war memorials that she would create, many of them in collaboration with Sir Robert Lorimer in Scotland. And there was a whole plethora of artistic responses to the conflict.
Am I right? Maybe I've got this wrong. Was Nora Nielsen Gray, she also did some war memorials?
I'm not sure. No, that was Alice Meredith who did that war memorial, which is a stunning piece of sculpture.
Yeah. And then we come on to one of the, and I can remember this person, I can remember Edward Palazzi.
Yes.
Let's look at him.
Well, Eduardo Palazzi is, he represents this 20th century urge in Scottish artists to, I think, move well beyond the boundaries of Scotland. We are now on a global stage, on a global platform. And Edoardo Palazzi went to Paris in 1947, and he had exposure to Duchamp. He had exposure to the Dadaists, the Surrealist art, which, I mean, was not getting much of a look in Scotland. And the imagery that he was looking at inspired him to use a pile of magazines that he'd been given by American GIs still in Paris. And when he came back to London, he gave a lecture in 1952 in the ICA, in which this extraordinary image was represented, a slideshow in which he was showing cutouts from magazines of Walt Disney characters, skyscrapers, Americana. And in this image, where we see the very word pop, we have the birth of pop art long before it was actually manifesting itself in America. So in the 20th century, we've got these Scottish artists who are absorbing the latest happenings on a world stage and who are responding to it with enthusiasm that is so uplifting.
Which makes me think, funnily enough, of my hometown, and two artists who did not, I think, get the treatment they deserved, and that was Kahuna McBride. I mean, they were astonishing artists.
Well, Kahuna McBride were astonishing artists, but they're also in themselves a great melodrama.
Yes.
I mean, during World War II, Kahuna McBride were in London, where they painted and partied alongside Francis Bacon and Graham Sutherland, and you know, at the very epicentre of the London art scene. And they were very much inspired not just by the booze that they were so enthusiastically drinking, but by an artist called Jankel Adler, who was a Polish emigrant artist who had come over during the war, and along with other Polish artists, including Joseph Herman, they were shipped to Glasgow, and they had an extraordinary impact on the artistic scene in Scotland because they brought with them knowledge of what was happening in Paris in the work of artists like Picasso, the distortions and the abstractions that particular artist was using. He moved to London, and he actually lived in the same building as Kahun and McBride, and they were absolutely, they venerated Jankel Adler, and not only because he had been, you know, a soldier, he had been all across Europe during the most exciting period of artistic creativity. He knew Picasso, and he gave them some of Picasso's secrets. So Kahun and McBride began creating images that seemed to express the angst of society in this particular period of conflict. And they were creating images that used the sort of abstraction, the distortions, and they were, at the time, a phenomenon. Kahun and McBride were the most famous artists in Britain. Francis Bacon said that he learnt pretty much everything there was to learn from those artists, and their work was being shown and purchased in America and New York. Is in the collection at MoMA. Now, I mean, yes, it's arguable that they deserve a much better reputation than they have today. And all I can say is I hope that the book begins to express my enthusiasm for them.
And then we link forward and we come to, in a sense, someone that then informed what happened next. I mean, I know all art informs what happens next, but Bruce MacLean particularly. Let's see the Bruce MacLean image, and you've got more than one in the...
Well, the story of 20th century Scottish art is kind of polar opposites. There is a tradition of painterliness and figurative painting, which my father was part of, and artists like John Byrne represent, which was one strand. But there was also emerging in the 1960s a strand of extraordinary experimentation. Bruce MacLean had studied as a young man at Glasgow School of Art. And in 1963, at the time when my dad was actually teaching at Glasgow School of Art, he went to London and he enrolled at St Martin's, at the time when St Martin's was the most sort of experimental art school in the country. And whilst he was there, Bruce started making work, sculptures, not out of clay, but out of perspex, out of plastic, and indeed out of his own body. And this particular work is from 1971, and in it he is using his own body to make fun of the traditions of sculpture that he had been taught to work in, perhaps when he was at Glasgow School of Art. He's using parody and humour to challenge the idea of what art is, what it could be. And I think that he is sowing the seeds of something that really bore fruit, particularly in Glasgow in the 1980s, and which we have seen in the kind of the roster of Turner Prize winners and nominees who come out of Glasgow.
Absolutely, and really, Bruce MacLean in a way was the kind of it kind of anticipated what would become the environmental art MFA. And for the last image, we've got an image of a wonderful artist, Turner-nominated, Christine Borland.
Yeah. Well, during the 1980s, at Glasgow School of Art, a course was devised for those students who didn't want to either do fine art painting or sculpture, and it was called the Environmental Art Course. And it was sort of a safe space where young students could come and they could explore a whole host of ideas, creating works with old computers, all objects that they'd found in shops, creating works that all depended upon their context and the environment in which they were exhibited in. It was conceptual art, and Christine Borland is, one of the triumphs of that.
She is, and the other thing about that was that grouping. So many Turner nominees and so forth, but also people that are really working on the world stage. Like Martin Boyce, like Nathan Coley, Douglas Gordon, Kathy, all sorts of people who actually have made a new way of doing art. The figurative painters that came before, because obviously Alison Watt was a little bit ahead, Wisniewski, Conroy, Stephen Campbell.
Well, I think their contribution is vital, and their kind of presence at the very forefront of British conceptual art. And I say British because in their work, I think we are beginning to explode borders and boundaries. It's not really Scotland, I say British, it's not really British. It's an international school of creativity now that I think possibly transcends where you come from.
But I think also in work, people like Ross and Claire, it is about having a conversation. And environmental art was very much about having a conversation.
But I think, regardless of that, one of the things that makes Scottish art particular is that whilst all of this has been evolving and exploding, there has been a willingness to nurture traditions that we've seen from the very earliest part of this history of Scottish art, from Ramsay and Raeburn, a painterliness and a willingness to remain wedded to figurative painting that certainly in England petered out for quite a while. I think these polar opposites remain part of Scottish creativity today, and I hope to celebrate them for years to come.
Well, let's pick up some people very kindly sent in questions. And we'll just go back very quickly to Arthur Melville. This is from Richard Watt. Delighted to see Arthur Melville on the cover of the book. Who knows what he would have produced had he lived longer?
Yeah.
Shouldn't he be more widely appreciated?
Yeah, well, I think Arthur Melville is the greatest British watercolourist of his time. And watercolour is a medium that's often associated in that period with great English painters, Turner earlier and John Sale Cotman and so on. But I think that the way that Arthur Melville uses watercolour, it just electrified the medium. And I do believe that he should be better known. He died of typhus at a young age in his 40s, I think. And he is one of many great Scottish artists, including Joan Airdley, who died well before their time.
Here we are. Why is Joan Airdley not more world famous? I think this is from Rachel Sayers. Why is Joan Airdley not more... I can remember going to an auction room in Cresswell Lane in Glasgow, run by, I think, someone called Jude. And they could not shift to Joan Airdley. And it was about 1979, 1980.
Yeah, look, Scottish art has its home in Scotland, but I don't believe the art in this book is important because it's Scottish. I believe it's important because these are magnificent examples of human creativity. Joan Airdley is one of those artists who created stunning paintings. I'm afraid that narratives in art history are written in academic centres, and there is no doubt that in Britain, in London, many of the stories of British art have perhaps neglected the achievements of artists like Joan Airdley. Joan has, I think, one painting in the Tate. I mean, that's just not right. There needs to be a greater sense of empathy with some of these most wonderful Scottish artists across the board, because they deserve to be respected on a big stage.
Here's a question from Michael Waters. About 30 years ago, I accidentally stumbled upon Stephen Campbell's exhibition at the Third Eye Centre in Glasgow. To my breath away, I had no interest in art till then. What contribution do you think Stephen Campbell has made to Scottish art? And of course, at the gallery, at the National Gallery, there was a retrospective after his death, obviously, of Stephen Campbell's work.
Well, I remember that exhibition. I mean, I don't know what, I must have been 12 or something. I remember walking into that room and the walls were plastered in drawings. There was Je T'aime was playing on a stereo somewhere, an old record player. And these kind of surreal dreamscapes were up on the wall. And they were exciting paintings. They seemed to come from another era. They didn't necessarily look as if they'd emerged in the late 1980s in Scotland. But they were telling telling bizarre stories. They were transporting you into other worlds. They were part of a whole installation that I'm sure could have ignited the appetite of someone who knew little about art. And that is, it's such a wondrous thing that someone could have been turned onto art by walking into a gallery and experiencing that.
Well, when you're talking about exciting people's appetite, here is a question from Jane Tulloch. What advice do you have for people starting to collect Scottish art? Obviously, the big names may not be possible, but any suggestions about up-and-coming colourists, for example?
Well, I know one who could probably help you out. But, for a few bob. I think that it's a great question. If I was starting a collection at the moment, I would probably start looking at prints and engravings. I mean, there are wonderful... Scottish artists created wonderful prints and engravings at DIY Cameron, for example, which I think you can probably track down.
Like 50 quid.
Well, you can find at modest price, and you will find just as much brilliance in the execution, a drama, atmosphere, storytelling in a print than you will in a finished painting. So that's one place to start, I think.
And I think our final question here from someone called Rachel M. If you were to be given one piece of Scottish art to keep forever, what would it be?
Well, I think I'm going to circumvent this problem by going right back to the very beginning of the story, because there was...
Can't have a tummy bomb.
Well, I'm going to go even further back than that. There was one little object called the Westray Wifey, which was discovered on Orkney only recently. It was created around about 3000 BC. It's a small figurine carved out of sandstone. We think it's the very first representation of the human form ever discovered in Scotland or ever created in Scotland. It is abstract, it is poignant and powerful, it transports me into the mind of an artist from 5,000 years ago. I would absolutely adore to have that on my mantelpiece, I think. And
so you should. Lachlan Goudie, thank you very much. And remember, the story of Scottish art by Thames and Hudson is out now. Do buy it, and thank you very much indeed to Lyon Turnbull, your hospitality.